Perfect. Well, good morning or afternoon to everyone, depending on the country each of you are in. This time I'm in Miami, so for me it's still morning rather than afternoon. But thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be able to offer the second session, and I hope this one is a bit more practical and more fun, and that we can start using some of these ideas better. Today, according to the order we had planned with you, we are going to talk about the human being. Ultimately, wise people have always told us that it is important to know ourselves. And the better we know ourselves, the better we can manage ourselves to achieve greater inner peace. As we already said in the first session and will repeat in the following ones, it is very important for spiritual growth because it is also the gateway to the higher faculties of consciousness. The first thing we are going to say is that in the previous session, we saw that the universe is multidimensional, that it has many dimensions, and that each dimension is in some way a new world where energy vibrates at a higher frequency, and it can contain more information. So notice that what is being proposed now is that just as the universe is multidimensional, the human being is too, and therefore human beings have 4 bodies, not just one. Notice that if we think about it carefully, we will quickly recognize it. We have a physical body where we can experience sensations. Pay attention to the physical body, like this glass of water, and I see if it is cold, hot, etc. The physical body can capture sensations. Then we have an emotional body. We will also see it described in some books as the vital body, which is a body from another dimension, which is why we cannot touch or grasp it, but it is where we experience our emotions. And notice that up to this point, we share the physical body and the emotional body with advanced animals. For example, my dog has a physical body just like us and also has an emotional body. From there, human beings have 2 more bodies. We have the mental body, which is where abstract reasoning is possible for us. We no longer share that with animals. And we have the spiritual body, which has traditionally been called the soul. And well, I have no problem continuing to call it that. Notice the science somehow gets up to there. We also know, but this is through contemplative eyes, as mystics have always said, that we humans have a 5th body, which they call the imago Dei, the image of God or the essence of God that is in the soul. And therefore, each of these bodies has a different vibration. They are in different dimensions, therefore. And as always, the higher bodies, let's say the mental body or the spiritual body, are more significant. And the physical body and the emotional body are more fundamental or basic. And it is true that the mental body, being more significant, is anchored in the soul. But sorry, the spiritual body, the mind, for example, which is more significant, is anchored in the physical body, in the brain. But the mind evolutionarily has more value, let's say, than the physical body. The brain, as I said, we share it with other animals. Dogs also have brains not as specialized as ours. They don't have a neocortex as developed. But if you open their skull, you will see they have a brain. However, they cannot experience the abstract mind because the brain is not specialized. So the important thing to understand here is that when we talk about a human being, I really like the example that Annie Marquia uses to describe it. He says that a human being is like a horse-drawn carriage, where on one hand, the carriage itself is the physical body, the horses are the emotions that are the ones pushing. Those that give energy to the body govern the body role of the carriage. And the coachman is the mind, right? And of course, it's good for the horses to be spirited and powerful, but of course, they must be managed and kept under control, because if not, They can go off the road and take with them the driver, the carriage, and everything, right? And yet, Animarche says that the soul is like the master sitting inside, who is the one that knows the way, right? The coachman drives the horses, but the master sitting inside is the one giving the direction, right? And I think it's quite a good example to describe what a human being is. So let's focus on the following. Like everything made in the universe, we said in the first session, right? It is made of energy plus information or informed energy. The same thing happens with the bodies of the human being, right? So understanding that all bodies are energy is easy, isn't it? Even if it is of more or less vibration, and that's why we can only touch or see through the senses of the physical body. But we have to try and explain how information works in the human being, right? And then we all know that all energy must have its information file, right? So the physical body, for example, we all have known for a long time that it has its information archive, and we call that information archive genetic information, right? And genetic information is what makes one person male, another female, one of us tall or short, or we have more hair or less or whatever, right? All the physical characteristics of the human depend fundamentally on that information archive that is linked to the human body. So we should understand the genetic archive, which science has already identified. Science has also known for a long time that we have a second information file that we call the character or personality file. And it is the information linked to the emotional body and the mental body. For example, those of you who have more than one child can see that even though they have the same genetics, their personalities are often very different, which means it is a different file of information from the genetic file. But of course, since we have a soul or spiritual body, that soul or spiritual body, it also has to have its information file, right? Because everything that exists in the universe is energy plus information, and everything is composed of that. Of course, researchers refer to that information archive linked to the spiritual body as the consciousness archive to distinguish it from the other two, okay? And when I said in the first interview that I later saw there was a question we didn't get to answer, that this was a school for souls, well, of course, ultimately, that means we will explain that in more depth and why we say it. But ultimately, what that means is that the soul, right, has to keep filling its information archive. This glass of water, well, is filled up to here, right? In the next session, we will see what levels of consciousness are. And as the soul evolves spiritually, it fills its file of consciousness information more. And that is the purpose of physical existence on Earth, as we will see later. The important thing is to know that these three files are not identical, right? The genetic file and the character and personality file have two characteristics that distinguish them from the consciousness file that is linked to the soul. The first of these is that the genetic file and the personality file are corruptible. For example, if I drink 5 bottles of whiskey every night, I could end up with cirrhosis and damage my genetic archive, right? Or for example, if for a long time I allow them to nest in my brain, right? In my thoughts, well, negative circular thoughts, etc., I could end up with depression, and I have ruined my character and personality file, right? And the second characteristic of those first two files is that they dissolve with physical death. Obviously, when we die, right, our body decomposes and our mind dissolves, doesn't it? Those are the two characteristics that distinguish those two files from the highest file that is linked to the soul, because the file linked to the soul is incorruptible, meaning it comes with a factory guarantee where we cannot record anything other than an understanding of the truth. In the consciousness file, we do not record errors. That happens in the character and personality file. And that is what ensures that evolution is always ascending. And secondly, the consciousness archive does not dissolve with physical death. Because as we all know, and we will explain more in detail at the end of this session, the soul continues to grow spiritually after physical death. Another thing is that there are discrepancies about how that happens. We will talk about that at the end of the talk. But what everyone agrees on, or all spiritual traditions, both Western and Eastern, have always agreed on, is that after physical death, the soul continues its journey, although for the moment without a physical body. So understanding how these three archives function is useful, and it will help us manage ourselves better in some way. So notice that of those four bodies, I mentioned that we have, leaving aside the divine essence for a moment, which would be the fifth, the three lower bodies, the physical body, the emotional body, and the mental body form what we have always called the ego. The individual ego is formed by these three bodies, and each of these four bodies are possible operating centers from which the person acts or operates or understands. We know that at lower levels of consciousness, one operates more from instinct and from emotion. When a person develops further, they operate more from reason. And those who have reached the mystical consciousness, which we will also discuss in future sessions, operate more from the soul. And of course, the challenge for humans is to learn, to train, to operate from the highest center we have, because to operate from instinct and emotions, well, that's where animals are. The human being should aspire to operate more from reason, and ideally, whenever possible, from the soul, which is the highest operational center we have. Therefore, all the problems we human beings face stem from operating through the ego. The ego is what has limitations, right? And as I said before, the ego is the combination of those three lower bodies, and we must try little by little to learn to operate from the soul so that we can make spiritual growth more efficient and live more fully, right? Therefore, any process of spiritual growth is in some way a process of transcending the ego, right? And until we have transcended the ego, we will not have mystical level experiences, right? Because the ego somehow serves as an umbrella, doesn't it? For example, today it is sunny for me. If I go out to the garden, the sun will shine on me. And the only way it won't shine on me is if I use a parasol, right? An umbrella, and then I block the sun's rays, right? The human ego is continually blocking, right? So the sun, that grace, call it what we want, right? That help, right? That always comes to us from above, because the ego is responsible for all the emotional, mental, and physical conflicts we experience. These conflicts lower our vibrational frequency. And as our frequency decreases, it becomes harder for us to connect, right? With higher vibrational information, isn't it? It acts like a short circuit, doesn't it? To learn to transcend the ego faster and better, it is important that we understand what its needs are, right? Because if I understand the needs of the ego, then as things happen, I realize where they are coming from. And it's easier for me to transcend it, isn't it? So we could say that the ego has three basic needs, right? The first would be security. Let's say physical, emotional, economic, whatever. Security, the desire for security that every ego has, right? The second basic need of the ego is the control of the external, right? That everything outside of me is the way I like it. That my bank account is full, that my partner doesn't cheat on me, that my children don't get expelled from school, whatever, right? That my car doesn't break down. In other words, that everything outside of us is as we like it, not as God wants for our spiritual development, but as we like it, right? And the third basic need of the ego is the need we all have to be loved accepted, admired, or recognized by others. And these three basic needs of the ego are the ones that are causing problems in our lives all day long in some way and causing us anguish and stress. And what we have to start learning, because we already saw in the first session that both in Buddhism and Christianity, it is said that to stop suffering, one must cease egotistical desire. What we need to learn is to transcend that ego so that we no longer act based on our ego's needs, but according to God's will for our spiritual development. So I noticed that it's important to understand that it's not about eliminating the ego, as some say, because if we completely eliminated the ego, we would die physically, since eliminating the ego would require destroying the physical body. As long as we have a physical body, we will have instinct, emotion, feeling, mentalization, etc. Therefore, we don't have to think in terms of eliminating it, but in terms of neutralizing it or transcend it. That is, that the ego no longer governs our lives. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but of course, if we didn't have an ego, we couldn't communicate with each other, we couldn't act in the world in any way. We need that vehicle in order to act in the world, learn through our actions, and grow from our mistakes. That is why the ego is a wonderful instrument that God has given us to be able to grow spiritually when we are embodied in the most efficient and fastest way. Therefore, we should not hate it. We should not consider it anything negative. And certainly, there is no need to fight so much against it because we lose a lot of energy and bits of ourselves. It's easier to understand how it works, not to be caught off guard by it. And little by little, try not to let it govern our lives. And this is achieved, in my opinion, better by loving the ego until it dies, until it is neutralized, rather than fighting against it. Always spiritual understanding. It will produce more fruit than direct struggle and will consume less energy in the process. Therefore, we see that the human being has an ego. We have explained what the ego is. We have explained its needs. And that helps us better understand why human beings, in a way, have three ways of receiving information and grasping the truth. One is instinct, which we share with animals. Instinct does not reason. Instinct is made to protect, transmit, or end life. And therefore, it appears in us automatically. It does not have a sequential process. When you see a plate of food in front of you, you like it or you don't, but you don't reason why you like it or stop liking it, you just receive it. It is liking or disliking. I insist, we share instinct with animals. It obviously has its importance in our lives, but it is not what should govern them, because all fears reside in instinct. Against, for example, survival and many other things. Then, after instinct, the human being has the ability to reason that we no longer share with animals. And it is more evolved evolutionarily, obviously, than instinct. But above reason, we have the capacity for intuition, or the intuitive capacity. And we could define intuition in 2 or 3 ways. One is the direct apprehension of information without going through the sequential process of reasoning. Another way to define intuition is the ability to see essence instead of appearance. Because the rational mind, no matter how good it is, only sees appearance. And if the mind is very good, then it sees very sophisticated appearance, but it is still appearance. Our ability to see essence can only be done with the intuitive capacity, which develops when we precisely develop the contemplative capacity. That is why it's important to clearly distinguish between instinct and intuition. Because when we are reasoning, we know it clearly, right? It's A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. Additionally, it consumes energy. We get tired. That's why when we study every 2 hours, we have to get up, rest a little, stop the mind and then return, right? But however, intuition and instinct both appear directly, right? And one of the difficulties human beings have is learning to distinguish between instinct and intuition. Because the problem is that, of course, instinct has to go through reason. Otherwise, we would behave like animals, right? But intuition, if we pass it through reason, we ruin it, don't we? Oh, I was an expert in ruining it for many years, right? And I don't know, it took me a long time to learn to distinguish instinct from intuition. Because I shouldn't trust instinct somehow. I mean, I must pass it through reason, because clearly, otherwise, I would weigh 1,000 kilos, eat everything that's put in front of me, whatever, right? Whereas I should trust intuition, right? Because it's a way of knowing superior to reason. And the difficulty lies in distinguishing it, right? For many years, I had that difficulty because, of course, since both appear directly, how do I know if it's instinct, intuition, or where it comes from, right? Until a spiritual teacher gave me the solution, right? And he told me, look, Gonzalo, when an instinct appears, it never comes with an internal feeling of certainty and peace. Whereas if you are receiving an intuition, if you are using intuition, that intuition always comes accompanied from an internal feeling of certainty and peace. So the way to distinguish instinct from intuition is precisely through the certainty and peace it leaves in your internal feeling. I don't know if I'm explaining myself. Once I was given that explanation and trained a little, the truth is that it became much easier for me to trust my intuition and develop it. And of course, intuition is always faster, requires less effort, and consumes less energy than reason. So, knowing that we have these three ways to grasp reality, the important thing here is to understand that intuition is superior to reason, while instinct is inferior. That's why we say instinct is pre-rational. And intuition is translational, not well. Another thing that will help us manage ourselves better is to understand in a deeper way the difference between emotions and feelings. This is important because human beings suffer when we have negative emotions or negative feelings, and therefore to be able to heal them, we need to better understand the difference between one and the other. This is something that, surprisingly, even when you talk to specialized psychologists and psychiatrists, they are not very clear about. And sometimes the words emotion and feeling are used as if they were the same or interchangeable. And that is not the case. Let's look at emotions. And feelings are fundamentally distinguished by their origin. Emotions originate in the instinctive body, and that is why we share them with animals. While the feeling originates in the mental body, in the mental field, that's why they are called sentimental. Therefore, my dog has emotions but does not have feelings. What seem to us to be feelings in the dog are really emotions, because advanced animals do have emotional capacity, but they do not have sentimental capacity because they do not have an abstract mind. Therefore, to be able to have feelings, we must be able to reason. Because is this important? Because because they cannot be healed in the same way. When we are having negative emotions, we must do one thing. And when we are having negative feelings, it is better to do another thing. So when we are having emotions with fundamentally negative emotions, we can do only three things, fundamentally. One is to repress them. But we have all learned already that when we repress negative emotions, they are somatized, meaning negative effects are produced in the body, right? So it became fashionable in psychology and psychiatry to say, well, if it's not good to repress emotions, then let's express them. But of course, if we express negative emotions, we damage human relationships unless we are only expressing them against a wall. Therefore, what is being advised now when we have negative emotions is simply to learn to observe and release them. If we take on the role of witnessing our negative emotions and say, oh, Gonzalo, you're having a negative emotion as always, and laugh a little, it disappears quite quickly, right? That's why it's better not to fight directly against them, but to observe them as a witness and let them go, which is called letting them go or channeling them. But of course, when we have a negative feeling, we can't heal it in the same way. To heal a negative feeling, we have to learn to think differently about the person or events or whatever causes them, right? And if we think differently about the situation, the feeling will change, right? So, of course, spiritual understanding is what allows us to think differently about events and situations so that negative feelings can be easily transformed. We can provide some examples of this later if you want, or if there are any questions about it. Let's see. The important thing is that when there is spiritual growth, or for there to be spiritual growth, we must learn to quiet our lower bodies. Okay? A mystic is a person who has their emotions, their feelings very calm. Okay? And why? Because if not, those lower bodies bother us. Furthermore, if the emotion and the instinct are not calm, right, that will create quite a few problems for us and take away our peace. Okay? And it will make us operate more from those centers, right? Whereas if those centers are more quieted, we will have an easier time operating from the mind or from the soul, right? Which are operational centers, higher, right? Also, if the instinctive body or the emotional body is not calmed, we all know that we experience emotions that are polar. They have polarity. Sometimes they are negative, sometimes they are positive, depending on external circumstances, not on us, right? Now, if we calm those bodies, then emotions and feelings are no longer automatic, right? Instead, they are voluntary. And then by learning to be at peace in every external situation, we can choose what emotion or feeling we will use in each situation according to what is most convenient with the situation or the event, and therefore we will not lose peace. Of course, having feelings and emotions that are always voluntary and not automatic will guarantee that they will always be positive, because no one voluntarily will choose a negative emotion or feeling because it does not give you a good inner sensation. We suffer from negative emotions and feelings precisely when they are automatic and respond or react to external circumstances. Understanding the human being means recognizing the distinction between the brain, mind, and consciousness, as people often get confused about this. Let's see. The brain is a physical organ. It is in the third dimension and functions like a radio transistor. This is important to understand. I have a radio transistor at home. I turn it on and I adapt radio waves. I do not produce the radio programs inside the transistor. Additionally, if I change the dial on the transistor, then I can start receiving one frequency or another as I change the frequency of the device. Now, radio programs are not produced by the radio transistor. They are waves that come through the air, and the transistor captures them. Well, the brain is the most basic of those three things. The mind cannot be experienced by the brain, but it cannot be reduced to the brain. Let's think of the mind as the possible radio programs, and our brain will pick up some frequencies or others depending on the frequency of the energy I set on the transistor to tune in to FM 94.3 or FM 103. These are simply different vibrational frequencies that carry information. So our brain can capture higher or lower level information, fundamentally depending on our level of consciousness and spiritual development. It is true that some transistors are better than others. Transistors that are more powerful, less powerful, can receive shortwave and long wave. Other transistors are simpler, but ultimately they are transistors, right? And they capture mind, but they do not produce it. What must also be clear is that consciousness is superior to the mind. That is, consciousness is not a byproduct of the mind or thought, but rather a holon of greater complexity. In other words, the brain, as well as emotions, feelings, and the mind, are possibilities within the field of consciousness. And therefore, that hierarchical distinction must be clear. The mind is one of the possible depths of consciousness. Emotions, a possible depth of consciousness. The instinct, it is a possible depth of consciousness, but consciousness encompasses them all, includes them all, and transcends them all. So it is also important to know that the human brain has three layers, and that the first layer is the reptilian brain, which is the one we share with crocodiles and allows us flight, defense, whatever. We must understand that the functioning of that layer is much faster than the other two. And therefore, of course, when a lion is chasing us, for example, we are not going to stop to think about philosophy. We run, climb a tree, or do whatever we can. The second layer of the brain, called the mesencephalon, is where the emotional body or the vital body is anchored. And the third layer, the neocortex, is where we can think abstractly, play chess. In short, things that animals cannot do. Then, of course, as we will see in the levels of consciousness, at the lower levels of consciousness, they use more the two parts of the brain that we share more with animals, the reptilian brain and the brain, the mesencephalon and the higher levels of consciousness use more the biocortex and the higher mind than those other minds, let's say more inferior, so to speak. And that is why they are able to not react automatically. In the face of external stimuli, they somehow have the ability to choose, while when we are using those more primitive layers of the brain, there is no choice in how to react. I mean, we feel the threat of a lion and we run away before thinking about anything else. I don't know if I'm explaining myself. And that must be understood, which is why the neocortex must be developed, because the reptilian brain is much faster. And if the neocortex is not well developed, we cannot counteract it. That is why it is important to understand why some people struggle to act rationally. Emotion and instinct take over them, blocking the ability to reason. And that needs to be understood and known. Another important thing when we talk about human beings, we must distinguish our capacity to love from our capacity to have egoic affection. This is very important for our peace, and I explain it this way. When I was a young man, I would hear the gospel and they would tell me to love the enemy, love your neighbor as yourself. And I thought, but I can't love the enemy as I love my children. That's impossible. So I would give up. I wouldn't try to achieve it. Of course, I never understood. There is a very important difference between love and affection. And the gospel was not inviting me to feel affection for the enemy. It was inviting me to have love for the enemy. What is the difference between affection and love? It is very important for our peace to understand this. Let's see. Affection is a feeling, and therefore, like all feelings, it is variable. Second, affection needs an object to project onto. It is not abstract. That's why I always say, I love my children, my football team very much, my country, my whatever, but always the word my in front. And above all, another important aspect of affection is that affection depends on the behavior of the other person. It is never unconditional. For example, I love my partner very much until they are unfaithful with 5 people. Then maybe I love them a little less. So affection is a feeling. Love is not a feeling. We will never be able to experience universal love as a feeling. Do not get frustrated about it. It is a spiritual understanding. You realize that the other is your brother because at the soul level, he has the same father, and that we are all on a path of spiritual growth where we actually do need one another to grow. So affection is not made to love the enemy. In the same way that the nose is not made for hearing, the nose is made for smelling, then the enemy can only be loved from love. And do not get frustrated if you are not able to feel affection for what is not pleasant. I don't know if I'm explaining myself or pleasant for the ego. Notice that in Spanish, we have 2 words to differentiate between love and affection, amor and cariño. But the Greeks used 4 words to talk about this. One was storge, which was the affection you have for the family group, for close people and such. Another was eros, which referred to affectionate, passionate, erotic love, etc. Another was philia, which is the affection we feel for those who treat us well, let's say the reciprocity one. But finally, there was a 4th word, which was agape, and it meant unconditional love. Notice that the 3 Gospels are written in Greek, and the only word that appears was agape. Philia appears a couple of times, but only to explain a parable. However, the teaching of Jesus was agape, and that agape is not sentimental affection, but rather a spiritual realization of love. I don't know if I'm explaining myself. Then, to the extent that we place ourselves more in love instead of so much in egoic affection, so we will make our spiritual growth more efficient. And for the first time, it will be possible for us to, for example, love the enemy. But let's not try to feel affection for the enemy, because that will be impossible and will frustrate us. Well, another thing we need to recognize is that since we have 4 bodies, we must ask ourselves what the capacity of the soul is, right? Because the bodies have to serve a purpose. We have seen what the instinct is for. We have seen what the emotion or the mind is for. The mind is useful for playing chess, for example. So what is the soul for? What capability does the soul have that those 3 bodies do not have? In my opinion, as we haven't been so clear about the multidimensionality of the human being until recently, we have made a mistake that we have attributed all the faculties or possibilities that are in the soul to the mind. And so we have not understood that the soul also has certain abilities that the mind does not have, just as the mind has certain abilities that the physical body does not have, and so on. After thinking a lot about this, I propose to you, and this is just a proposal because this still needs much more investigation. We are in the early stages and just starting to look into it. But I propose that there are 3 capacities of the soul that are not of the mind, as we thought. One is internal freedom. Freedom is in the soul, not in the mind. I mean, the mind is like a computer. In a computer, the computer is not free. The computer processes very quickly and such, but it is not free. The user is free. The computer user is the one who can change the program or press one key or another. No? The computer simply executes. The instructions are carried out, but they are not chosen. That's why I believe that freedom is a matter of the soul and not of the mind. Another aspect that belongs to the soul rather than the mind is intention. That's why higher levels of consciousness are distinguished from lower ones by the purity of intention, and that is in the soul, not in the mind. It's the same example as a computer. A computer does not have intention. We have the intention when we turn it on, when we turn it off, for what we use it. I don't know if I make myself clear. And finally, I believe that the soul has the ability to see essence, whereas the mind, as I said before, only sees appearances. That's why the contemplative capacity is not in the mind, but in the soul. And it only develops when we know how to neutralize the mind, as all of you on this path know. Not to stop the mind so that we can intuit more easily and there aren't short circuits. For that reason, we can say that individuality is in the soul, but personality is in the ego. And we also need to understand that the human being is not a physical being having a transcendent experience, but a spiritual being that is having a learning experience. This is the fundamental difference between Aristotle and Plato. And now science is aligning more with Plato, as mystics always have, and now science is as well. That is why we can say that the human being is a spirit incarnated in time with an intention to learn. It is not a physical being having a transcendent experience. This is not our home. Our home is up there, and we come here to school. That is what needs to be understood. Therefore, this is not our home, this is our school. Notice that this is already being understood in all traditions. And recently I read a writing by Benedict XVI, where he said for the first time, I am preparing myself to go back home. He didn't say to die. He didn't say to go to heaven. He said to return home. And it's important for us to understand this. We are not in our home. We are in a school taking a course of learning. Therefore, we can see the human being as a soul in evolution. The other day, there was a question in the talk, I think. It said, why do you, Gonzalo, assert that the human being is a soul in evolution? I say, well, for two fundamental reasons. Because the mystics have always said it, and two, because now science, it makes it quite easy to understand, because the spiritual body is the most significant. It is the one that will last us eternally. And it doesn't make much sense for us to identify with what is only temporary in us, even if our senses deceive us, by making that seem real while denying reality to the soul just because we don't see or touch it. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So, why do I say that mystics have always said this? Look, if you'll allow me, I'll quote a citation that I have in my book on becoming spiritual from Saint Basil of Caesarea, who is a father of the church. As you know, there are, I believe, 15 fathers of the church, named fathers of the church: Saint Alphonsus Liguori, Saint Basil, Saint Augustine, Saint Thomas, and a few others. Well, Saint Basil says verbatim, forgive me. I will read it as always to avoid making mistakes. It says, you will finally discover that the world is truly the school where rational souls are educated. Quote from Saint Basil, specifically, you can find it in the Hexaemeron, homily 1.6. This is the Christian tradition. And in the Eastern tradition, the same is affirmed. Therefore, if we understand that this is a school for souls, then of course our perspective changes. And sometimes then what we want is to be given more difficult things to finish the course faster. I remember when I was 15 years old, I was bored with school. My school was an all-boys school. I wanted to go to university because there were both girls and boys, and everything was freer and so on. And I advanced the course in the summer. My friends went to the beach, but I skipped a grade because I wanted to finish as soon as possible and move on to better things. Well, the same thing happens to us with the soul. When we see things that are not pleasant for our ego and take away a bit of our peace, it shows us that we need them to grow, because otherwise they wouldn't disturb our peace. Therefore, instead of rejecting them, we can be thankful for them, and then we make our growth much faster. Notice that the other day, Pablo made an extraordinary introduction to these sessions, as always. And he said, well, I have already talked a lot about these topics with Gonzalo. And for me, that obviously has been a privilege, talking in depth with Pablo about these things. And he tells me we agree on almost everything, but not on everything. Well, look, what I'm about to say now is one of the points where we might not completely agree. Notice that I had the same experience with Rafael Domingo. Rafael Domingo Osle is the co-author of this book, Espiritualizarse. He is a top-level academic. He has been hired by Emory University, United States. He is an expert in the world of law and theology. And right now, he is a professor at Emory University in the Department of Law and Religion. He is a deeply Catholic man, highly knowledgeable in Catholic theology, and a practicing Catholic. The lesser importance that I attribute to the body, I know, has surprised Rafa and Pablo, because it is true that current Catholic doctrine places more importance on the body of what I give it. Well, we all agree, and we say it in the preface, and Pablo also agrees with me, that the soul is more important than the body. What happens is that I give much less importance to the body than Pablo or Rafa Domingo does, and it does not matter. Well, it is simply an opinion that is not so different, because both of us agree, we all agree that the soul continues its spiritual growth or purification after physical death, or whatever we want to call it. What happens is that I have seen that if we give less importance to the body, we will have more inner peace, because all the challenges that happen to a human being happen in the body, in the soul. The soul is not going to have cancer. The soul is not going to die in a car accident. So to the extent that we identify more with the soul and less with the body, we facilitate our inner peace. I believe it is also more in line with modern science, as we explained yesterday regarding the multidimensional topic. The body is more fundamental, but it is less significant. The soul lives eternally without the body, if I am making myself clear, after physical death. So in that sense, it is preferable. However, I understand that they may be right, and I may not be, and I know that Catholic doctrine considers the human being as a person who is a union between soul and body. But even St. Augustine, if you read him thoroughly, he explains that his opinion, of course, is that the soul pre-exists the body. And when we examine the levels of consciousness, we will see that all people from the moment of birth have different IQs, meaning different intellectual capacities, and also different spiritual levels or levels of consciousness in the soul at birth. So the question is, where does that come from? If the soul is created at the same time as the body, then of course they would all come with the same information. And it has been proven that this is not the case. So we would have to explain what prior journey the soul might have had, so that already from the moment of birth, in some way, people have different levels of consciousness. This is a topic I leave open, and obviously each person can think about it as they wish, but well, we have to decide what importance we are going to give to the physical body in our thinking or in our identification. When we change context, then some problems from the previous context, as we said in the first talk, well, they resolve themselves. I'll give you an example. Notice that for many years, we've had a conflict between creation and evolution. Either you are a Darwinist or a creationist, which one of the two is right? People. Some are in favor of one, some are in favor of the other. For example, if we shift to a broader context, we realize that both perspectives contain some truth and some error. The solution to the conflict, for example, between creation and evolution, is to think that the solution lies in a term called emergence or continuous creation. So yes, continued creation seemingly appears to be evolution. But it is not an evolution from the bottom up, but rather from the top down. Yes, consciousness continuously creates different forms as needed. And to us, this appears to be evolution, but it is not evolution. It is emergence or continuous creation. Well, with this, it's the same. You have the mental context, right? So we have to choose it, among other things, by the fruits it yields. In the gospel, when they ask Jesus about some prophets or others, or about some ideas or others, Jesus always replied, "You will know them by their fruits." Once again, when I have doubts between one thing and another, as I mentioned in the first session, I try to turn to the three eyes of knowledge to see what all three have said about the topic. But another thing I also use is a bit of the internal sense of fruit. And I say, well, if I give less importance to the physical body, I gain peace. That is evident. It is an obvious result. So I insist, though unintentionally, I do want to point out that I give less importance to the physical body, whereas Rafael Domingo, the co-author of the book with me, and Pablo Dorf place slightly more importance on it. Surely they are right, and I may not be, but that's why I wanted to highlight it, because I believe this is one of the few points where at times we have not shared the same perspective in everything else, or in almost everything else. Thank God we have, which gives me a lot of peace that it is so too. Notice also that all mystics have had a certain urgency to abandon the body. For example, St. Paul, who will deliver me from this body of death. For example, St. Teresa of Avila, I die because I do not die. Once you see and understand the other spiritual reality, you say, what am I doing in a diving suit? I remember many years ago, my children wanted to learn to dive here in Miami. And a man arrived with some oxygen tanks and a diving suit. No? So I put on the diving suit to enter the water, but as soon as I emerged, I wanted to remove it as quickly as possible. Because of course it was limiting my perception. I couldn't see to the sides. In short, it was much better to be in the open air without the diving suit. And I think that with the soul, it is somewhat similar. When it detaches from the physical body, its perceptive abilities increase, which the physical body somehow limits so that we can have the experiences we are having. So this is just an observation I wanted to leave for each person to reflect on and resolve as they see fit. But in any case, whether we believe the physical body has little or no importance, as in my case, or that it has more importance, as might be the case for Pablo and Rafael Domingo, what we do need to understand is that in any case, the soul is more important. However much importance we give to the body, please let us focus on the soul. And I will end with this so that there may be questions, but notice that this is clear in the gospel. The primacy of the soul over the body in so many teachings of Jesus. For example, if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better to lose the hand than to ruin the soul. Or for example, do not worry, Saint Matthew, do not worry about those who kill the body. They cannot kill the soul. Or another, and wars and tribulations will come, but do not worry because they are necessary. Necessary for what? For the development of the soul, even if the body dies. The fact that God arranges it in some way of the bodies with such ease, and they die in earthquakes, traffic accidents, from diseases, in wars, etc. So it tells me what it seeks, let's say. God's focus is on the growth of the soul, and if for that to happen, a body must be sacrificed, then it is not of great concern. So this ultimately resolves for us maybe this famous theological question that was so difficult to resolve now: why do bad things happen to good people? I remember that a 10-year-old girl asked the Pope that in a video, and the Pope replied, well, dear, this is something that theology is still working on, and so on. Of course, when viewed through the lens of multidimensionality, as we have explained today, we realize that this question has no simple answer because it is fundamentally misframed. It's that nothing bad ever happens to good people. If by people we mean souls, right? Am I explaining myself? It happens to bodies, but not to souls. And therefore, for a soul to have cancer is not necessarily something bad. I have many friends of mine who, after having a significant illness, have undergone a spiritual transformation, which can turn it into something good and not bad. It depends on the point of view we are using. What happens to us is bad for the body, but also bad for the soul. That is the question we have to ask ourselves. And often we will discover that this is not the case. And therefore, well, we have to be clear that
Whether we give more or less importance to the body, the soul is the priority, and we need to learn to operate from that operational center and understand that everything that happens to us is aimed at the evolution of our soul, even if it endangers the body. With this, I conclude the presentation. 50 minutes have passed, and if it seems good to you, we'll leave time for any questions you may have.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Thank you very much for this beautiful talk about the soul. There are many questions, so we will select a few. There is a very beautiful one. What does Gonzalo say about returning home after physical death? Could some remnant of the personality archive remain even after transcending the ego?
In my opinion, let's see. In my opinion, this happens. We know that we live in a field of consciousness, which we call the Akashic fields in the first session, or the AS fields, or the zero fields with Z, where everything is recorded. That is to say, it is true that the ego dissolves, the personality archive dissolves, but not before recording it in those fields. What remains of it is a recording, so to speak. The body itself does not remain, but a recording of everything that body has experienced does remain. And therefore, we can say that the body itself does not endure after death.
The soul no longer needs mind or instinct to continue perceiving, growing, and purifying, but all experiences or all events or whatever remains recorded in those Akashic records or in that field of consciousness that personality has experienced while it has been active. Although that personality no longer accompanies the soul afterward, its experiences are recorded.
That's how I would answer the question.
There is a lot of interest in the soul among the attendees, among the participants. They ask if the soul is individual, and they also ask if you can clarify the difference between soul and spirit.
I am going to try. Sometimes it is a matter of semantics more than anything else. What do we mean when we say the word? Let's see. I think the soul is individualized spirit. I mean, I believe that the children of God are the souls, not the bodies. And I believe that what is made in the image and likeness of God is the soul and not the body. Since God does not have a physical body, it's a different matter that Jesus incarnated, but God does not have a physical body. So I believe that the spirit is a spirit. It is the spiritual world. It is the spirit that is unified like consciousness. And I think the soul is an individualized spirit. I say it is spirit because it is not material like the brain, and it is individualized because each soul has its experiences and is a child of God. And what the soul learns to do over time and spiritual growth is to unite with God. But of course, my soul is different from the soul of my neighbor, and it has a different level of consciousness. And as we will see in other talks, it is a distinct destiny. There are souls that have to go through one experience and other souls have to go through others. That's why I said that individuality is in the soul,
and therefore the soul is individual. For me, in my semantic conception of things, the spirit,
it is unified, just as consciousness is unified. Another thing is that each of us participates in a greater or lesser depth of consciousness, but consciousness is a unified field. Notice that I, from the point of view of physics, could define the soul as a package of energy with individualized information. But the soul must have a container because otherwise it wouldn't be individualized. Just like the body has a container in some way, although in reality that's not so clear, but for our senses it is clear.
And I think for me, my way of understanding it is that the spirit is one and souls are individualized spirits.
Here is another very beautiful question. How can we explain God's action within the interior of the human being?
Explaining God and his actions is a bit impossible for us. What we do know, because the gospel tells us, is that the sun always shines for the just and the unjust. There is always an action of God towards us. The gospel also tells us, you take one step towards me, and I will take 100 towards you. Moreover, without God's grace, we wouldn't even exist, nor could we do anything or grow spiritually. Therefore, there is indeed a continual action of God in us, and I believe that the most important work of the human being is to remove obstacles so that this action can occur. And the obstacles are in the ego. So when we transcend the ego, that action of God can work much better in us than if we do not transcend the ego, because we are blocking it. How does it happen? Man, I can imagine that it is the attraction that the slower vibration energies, as we've always said, only have the slower vibration once. But I suppose understanding the mechanism in depth, how that happens or how it comes about, we might still be a bit far from understanding. But come on, I have no doubt at all that it does happen. And besides, it is something that is no longer theoretical for me, but rather I have personal experience with it. So having experienced it, I can't doubt it. But how it happens, well, see how the higher vibration energies and information affect the lower ones. Just like a transfer of temperature occurs in water molecules, if cold water is underneath and hot water on top. But over time, science will help us better understand how that process occurs.
Maybe that's a mystery.
Yes, it's still a bit of a mystery, but well, it's important to understand that it does happen. And it's important to understand that we facilitate it by transcending the ego. With those two things, I think that's enough for us, right? And I suppose that at a later stage of our development, either technological here or in terms of consciousness, we will be able to better understand how that is done.
Any more questions? Here is another one. How can it be explained that despite knowing we are going to die, our mind forgets that and instead focuses on trivial daily concerns?
Well, that's the ego. I mean, the ego loves to worry about trivialities. The ego loves to create problems when they don't exist. That's what the ego does. It's its nature. And therefore, we have to know that this is the ego. However, as many of you know, many studies, thousands and thousands of studies on near-death experiences have already been done, and many psychiatric regressions have also been conducted. And that's why we begin to understand that death doesn't exist. Death is simply a change of experience. That is why mystics are, so to speak, in a hurry to die, because it is like shedding a weight, a burden, finishing a course, and returning home for a vacation. When we were in school, who didn't feel like going on vacation? Then only the lack of understanding of what the spiritual world is can lead us to close ourselves off so much. Next in school, but when there's an understanding or a direct vision of it, it is true there's a hurry to go home and we go running. Who wants to stay in a 2-star hotel when you can be in a 5-star one? Nobody. Since we do not know the 5-star hotel, we don't seek it. Let me give a silly but quite funny example, something that happened to me in real life. Once I owed a favor to a friend of mine, a very good friend, and I wanted to invite him on a trip to the Caribbean, a week in the Caribbean, to thank him. And I remember he came with his wife, and we had a very nice hotel with 2 cabins on the beach and so on. And well, we settled into the 2 cabins. We were delighted. It seemed wonderful to us. But I, who am a bit of a restless person sometimes, well, I took one of those golf carts from the hotel to look at the rest of the hotel. And of course, I mean, when I went to the other end, I saw that there were the same 2 cabins, but also with a lounge in the middle and in a better spot on the beach. And when I went to ask my friends for permission, because I thought there wouldn't be a problem, I went to speak to the hotel manager. This way, they let us change rooms to go to the other side. Well, after much discussion, because one day it couldn't be done, I managed to make it happen. No, and my surprise was when I went to this friend's couple to tell them we were moving. No? That, they said, no way, this is wonderful. Nothing can be better than this, and so on. I said, here we go. I've messed up because now I've changed. The guy is coming to pick up the clothes. They'll charge us for the other thing. The others who were going to the other side are going to be sent to this side. It's turned into an incredible mess. And the only thing I could think of was to tell my friends, look, don't worry, we're not switching, but come with me. In the golf cart, I'll show you another part of the hotel where if we come again, well, maybe they couldn't say no to that, of course. And then when they got on the cart with me and we got to the other place, I said, well, of course, we have to change, right? So many times we cling to what we know. It seems great to us, whatever it is. And we can't even imagine that there might be something better. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, right? So the spiritual world is very real. And also probably in higher vibration dimensions, you don't have to make any effort. For example, you think of something and it's already there, right? You don't even have to go, you know? So that's why I think we need to understand that the spiritual world is richer, more real. Less cumbersome, right? Because which is the densest, and therefore going back home for vacation after a good course is not something we should worry about.
Thank you, Gonzalo. One last question. It says that the capacity of the soul in adolescence is the contemplative capacity.
Yes.
So how do you define intuition? Is it the same?
Well, yes, intuition is the same. As I mentioned before, intuition is the direct apprehension with H of information. It can also be defined as the ability to see essence. Some authors also define it as the ability to recognize patterns, right? But I believe, personally, I believe that the ability to recognize patterns could also be a mental capacity of the mind that synthesizes, that relates things well with one another. For me, I would define intuition as the direct apprehension with H of the information without going through the sequential process of the mind. And I would also define it as the ability to see essence. For me, they are the 2 best definitions.
Very well, Gonzalo. Thank you very much. And many people are also expressing their gratitude in the chat.
Thank you very much to you.
I think today has been a beautiful talk about the soul and the essence, and also about our emotions, right?
Thank you very much to you all, as always. I believe knowing ourselves better and understanding these things well will help us have much more inner peace. We will also see it in the other sessions with the other topics. And I am delighted and very grateful to be able to spend this time with you.
Thank you, Gonzalo.
Thank you all. See you next time.
Until next time.